My husband said he was going back to his ex after 10 years. I just smiled and said, okay. Florida humidity has a way of slowing conversations down, not because people run out of things to say, because the air feels thick enough to hold words in place for a moment before they fall. That night, the air inside the kitchen felt exactly like that. Heavy. Alara stood barefoot on cool tile, stirring a pot of rice while steam curled upward toward the ceiling fan. The wooden spoon moved in quiet circles. Simple motion. Familiar rhythm. From the living room, the television filled the house with the bright voices of cartoon characters arguing about something completely ridiculous. 5-year-olds take cartoons very seriously. "Julian, it was my turn," Juliet shouted. "No, it wasn't." Julian answered immediately. "It was yesterday. That was Dinosaur Day. Well, today is Princess Day." The debate carried into the kitchen like tiny thunder. Alara smiled to herself. 5-year-old arguments are honest. They start quickly, end quickly, and nobody holds grudges longer than a few minutes. Children believe the whole world exists inside their house. Julian had Kingston's curious eyes. Juliet had Alara's quiet patience. Alara noticed those things often, small details most people overlook. Maybe it came from the way she grew up. In some homes, people survive by paying attention. You learn early that the truth usually lives inside pauses more than words. And Kingston had been pausing a lot lately. Not normal pauses. The kind where someone stops halfway through a sentence like their mind stepped outside for air. Kingston leaned against the kitchen counter behind her, scrolling slowly through his phone. He looked busy, but Alara knew the difference between someone reading and someone avoiding a thought. His thumb moved down the screen again, but his eyes weren't following it. They were somewhere else. Alara. He said her name quietly. Just her name. Nothing else. She didn't turn around right away, because she already recognized that tone. Some conversations enter a room before the words show up. Julian ran through the kitchen at that exact moment, holding a plastic dinosaur over his head. "Daddy, look, T-Rex." Kingston scooped him up with one arm and growled dramatically. "Roar." Julian laughed so loudly, it echoed against the hallway walls. Juliet walked behind them, shaking her head with the serious judgment only little sisters possess. "Boys are weird." Alara covered a laugh with the back of her hand. For a moment, the house felt light again. The kind of normal that tricks people into believing nothing difficult is waiting nearby. But life rarely cancels uncomfortable conversations. At best, it delays them. Julian and Juliet ran back to the living room. Cartoon music swelled again. Kingston placed his phone on the counter slowly. "Alara, we need to talk." Now she turned around, not alarmed, just observant. His shoulders were tight, eyes drifting slightly away from hers, fingers tapping once against the marble countertop like someone rehearsing courage. People who know each other deeply learn to recognize the difference between someone thinking and someone deciding. Kingston had already decided something. Alara could feel it. "What's going on?" she asked calmly. Kingston inhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take before stepping into cold water. "I think," he started, then stopped. Another pause. The air in the kitchen felt thicker somehow. Finally, he said it. "I think I'm going back to my ex." The sentence landed quietly. No shouting, no crashing sound, just a quiet fracture. Alara blinked once. 10 years, 2 children, a house filled with memories. And Kingston had compressed the weight of it into 9 words. He kept talking quickly now, like someone trying to outrun their own discomfort. "I've been thinking about it for a while. I never felt like things were really finished between us. Between us." Interesting choice of words. Not between him and Alara. Between him and someone from another chapter of his life. Alara watched his face carefully. There it was. Not guilt. Something more complicated. Regret mixed with confusion. Like a man who had followed a map for years, only to wonder if he started in the wrong place. Then Kingston said the sentence that changed the temperature of the room. "I never really loved you the way I should have." Some truths arrive gently. Others land like glass breaking inside a quiet house. From the living room, Julian and Juliet burst into laughter at something happening in the cartoon. The cheerful theme song started again, bright, loud, completely unaware that something had shifted in the kitchen. Life kept moving forward inside the house as if nothing had changed. But something had. A whole decade had just cracked open. Kingston waited. Most people expect certain reactions in moments like this. Anger, crying, accusations, arguments about loyalty and history and promises. Instead, Alara did something he didn't expect. She smiled. Not sarcastically, not bitterly, just calm. "Okay," she said. Kingston blinked. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it." His forehead wrinkled. "I thought you'd be upset." Alara leaned back against the counter and folded her arms. Her voice stayed gentle. "Kingston, if someone has to convince themselves to stay with you, they're already gone." The sentence settled into the room with more weight than shouting ever could. Kingston stared at her. Maybe he expected a fight. Maybe he needed one. Sometimes people confess difficult truths, hoping the other person will react strongly enough to erase their doubt. But Alara wasn't interested in that kind of love. Her grandmother used to say something when Alara was young. "Baby, don't chase people who already know where you live." That wisdom had stayed with her longer than most advice. Kingston rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought this would be harder." Alara shrugged slightly. "Hard things don't always look dramatic." She walked past him toward the living room. Julian and Juliet sat on the floor sharing popcorn from the same bowl. Julian offered a piece to his sister. Juliet accepted it like a queen granting permission. That small moment filled Alara's chest with warmth. Children don't understand adult storms, and maybe that's a blessing. When she returned to the kitchen, Kingston was still standing there, waiting. "You're really okay with this?" he asked again. Alara grabbed 2 plates from the cabinet. "I didn't say that." He looked confused. "Then why are you smiling?" She paused for a moment. This time her smile held something Kingston didn't understand yet, because sometimes the end of something painful is also the beginning of something honest, and honesty can feel strangely peaceful. "Because," she said softly, "I already knew." Kingston froze. "What do you mean you knew?" Alara set the plates down on the table. Her voice stayed calm. "Kingston, people don't suddenly leave after 10 years. She looked directly into his eyes. "They leave slowly." The house grew quiet again. But this silence felt different. Not shock. Truth. And before we continue, let me pause here for a second. Welcome to Mr. Stevens Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're truly glad you're here. Subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And while you're watching this story, take a moment to comment the time and where you're watching from. It's always amazing seeing how far these stories travel. Now here's a question for you. Have you ever felt someone slowly leaving your life, long before they actually said the words? Tell me in the comments, because Alara sensed something long before this night. What Kingston didn't realize yet was that Alara had been preparing for this moment far longer than he imagined, and the most surprising part of their story hadn't even begun yet. Florida rain doesn't usually arrive politely. It comes fast, loud, and confident, like the sky has something important to say. By the time dinner was ready, rain was drumming steadily against the roof. The windows rattled softly with each burst of wind, and the outside world blurred into streaks of gray water sliding down the glass. Inside the house, the kitchen lights made everything feel warm. Alara placed 4 plates on the table, while Julian and Juliet climbed into their chairs like tiny athletes preparing for competition. Julian raised his fork dramatically. "Tonight, I'm a hungry dinosaur." Juliet rolled her eyes. "You say that every day." "That's because dinosaurs are always hungry." Alara smiled and placed vegetables on both plates. "Well, this dinosaur still has to eat his broccoli." Julian examined the broccoli with suspicion. "Dinosaurs didn't eat broccoli." Juliet leaned forward with complete confidence. "Yes, they did. The green ones did." Kingston sat quietly across from them. His fork moved through the rice slowly, but he barely took a bite. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away from this kitchen table. Alara noticed. She always noticed. But she didn't say anything. People reveal more when they aren't interrupted. Julian looked up suddenly. "Daddy, why are you sad?" The question dropped into the room without warning. Kingston blinked. "I'm not sad, buddy." Juliet tilted her head, studying him carefully. "You look like when Mommy watches the news." Alara laughed softly. That girl had instincts. Kingston forced a smile, and reached across the table to ruffle Julian's hair. "I'm fine. Eat your food, dinosaurs." The twins returned to their dinner conversation, now debating whether sharks could beat dinosaurs in a fight. Children are good at returning to normal. Adults take longer. The rain grew heavier outside. Water rushed through the gutters along the edge of the house, creating a steady rushing sound that filled the quiet spaces between sentences. Dinner finished the way family dinners usually do. Messy plates. Julian dropping his fork twice. Juliet reminding everyone she was the responsible twin. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of parenting, something new sat quietly between Alara and Kingston. Not anger. Distance. The kind that appears when two people realize they have been living inside different thoughts for a long time. After the dishes were cleared, Alara helped the twins brush their teeth. Julian attempted to brush for 3 seconds before declaring victory. Juliet brushed like a scientist conducting an experiment. Soon both children were tucked into bed. Julian stretched across the mattress like he had conquered a mountain. Juliet curled beside him, holding her stuffed rabbit. Alara stood quietly in the doorway for a moment, watching them breathe. 5 years. Sometimes she still couldn't believe 2 tiny humans had grown from a love story that once felt so uncertain. Kingston stood behind her in the hallway. "They look peaceful," he said softly. "They are." Neither of them moved. Finally, Kingston spoke again. "When did you know?" Alara didn't answer immediately. She closed the bedroom door halfway before turning toward the living room. "I didn't know the exact day," she said, "but I knew the season." Kingston frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" They moved into the living room. The rain outside had slowed, leaving faint drops sliding down the windows. Alara sat in the chair across from the couch. Kingston remained standing for a moment before sitting down. "It means something started changing a long time ago," she said calmly. Kingston rubbed his hands together. "You're making it sound like I've been planning this for years." "No," Alara replied gently. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" She leaned back in the chair. "Do you remember the beach trip 3 summers ago?" Kingston thought for a moment. "Clearwater?" She nodded. "You spent half the trip on your phone. I had work stuff." Alara smiled slightly. "You've had work stuff every year." Kingston shifted uncomfortably. "That doesn't mean anything. Maybe." She looked toward the rain sliding down the glass. "Kingston, do you know something interesting about distance?" "What?" "Most people think distance begins with big arguments." He watched her quietly. "But real distance usually begins with small absences," she continued. "Shorter conversations, longer silences, hugs that don't last as long." Kingston leaned forward. "You're making it sound like I abandoned you." Alara shook her head slowly. "No, that's not what happened." "Then what happened?" She took a moment before answering, like someone sorting through old memories. "What happened," she said carefully, "is that we started asking different questions." Kingston frowned. "I don't understand." Alara looked at him steadily. "You were still trying to understand who you used to be, and I was learning who I was becoming." The sentence stayed between them. Kingston exhaled slowly. Then he said something he had been holding back all evening. "She reached out to me 6 months ago." Alara didn't look surprised. "On social media," he added quickly. "At first we were just catching up." Alara nodded. "I figured." Kingston stared at her. "You figured?" "Yes." "How?" Alara laughed softly. "Kingston, I'm not psychic." "Then how did you know?" She leaned forward slightly. "Because people glow differently when they reconnect with their past." He blinked. "You noticed that?" "Alara notices everything," she said with a small shrug. For a moment, Kingston didn't know what to say. Then curiosity pushed through his confusion. "So you've just been waiting?" The word sounded strange in his mouth. "Waiting for what?" "For this conversation." Alara shook her head slowly. "No." "Then what?" "For honesty." Another quiet pause filled the room. Finally, Kingston asked the question that had been bothering him since the kitchen. "If you knew, why didn't you stop it?" Alara smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes now, something steady. "Because love shouldn't require surveillance." Kingston leaned back against the couch, absorbing the sentence. "Besides," she added, "if someone wants to leave, no amount of watching will change their direction." The rain had stopped completely now. The world outside felt still. Kingston studied Alara's face. "You're handling this better than anyone I know." Alara tilted her head slightly. "You think this doesn't hurt?" "I don't see it hurting." "That's because pain doesn't always shout." Her voice softened just a little. "Sometimes it sits quietly and asks you better questions." "What kind of questions?" Alara looked down the hallway where Julian and Juliet were sleeping. Questions like, what kind of love do I want my children to learn from watching us? What kind of strength do I want my daughter to grow into? What kind of respect do I want my son to show one day? Kingston followed her gaze down the hallway. For the first time that night, the weight of everything he had said earlier returned to his chest. "You're a good mother," he said quietly. Alara smiled. "I try." Then Kingston said something unexpected. "There's something else." Alara looked back at him. He hesitated before continuing. "The truth is, I've been feeling like I don't recognize my life anymore." Alara listened carefully, not interrupting. "I wake up some mornings and feel like I'm living someone else's story," he continued. "And going back to her feels familiar. Familiar, not exciting, not passionate, just familiar." Alara nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." Kingston looked surprised. "You're not going to argue with that?" "No. Why not?" "Because familiarity is powerful." She paused, then added something that made Kingston sit up straighter. "But familiarity isn't the same as love." The sentence hung quietly in the room. Kingston exhaled slowly. "You might be right." Alara leaned back again. "Probably." He laughed awkwardly. "Okay. You're definitely right." For a moment, they both smiled. The tension softened slightly. Then Alara said something Kingston didn't expect. "You should go see her." He blinked. "You're serious?" "Very. Why would you want that?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Because unfinished stories have a way of haunting people." Kingston studied her carefully. "You're not afraid I won't come back?" Alara paused for a moment. Then she gave the most honest answer she could. "If you don't come back." She shrugged gently. "Then at least we'll know the truth." Kingston didn't realize it yet, but something inside him had shifted during this conversation. Because the woman sitting across from him was not reacting the way he expected. There was no begging, no accusations, no emotional chaos, just quiet strength. And for the first time since he walked into the kitchen earlier, Kingston felt something unexpected, uncertainty, not about leaving, but about whether leaving meant losing something he hadn't fully understood. There's something unusual about houses after midnight. Not silence exactly. More like the walls begin remembering things. The twins were asleep down the hallway. The rain earlier had washed the Florida air clean, leaving the neighborhood quiet except for the soft turning of the ceiling fan above the living room. Kingston sat on the couch staring at nothing in particular. 10 years of marriage had just been folded into one evening conversation, yet the house looked exactly the same. Same couch, same family photos on the wall, same faint smell of coconut oil from Alara's hair products drifting through the hallway. But something inside him felt unfamiliar, like he had stepped slightly outside his own life. He heard footsteps behind him. Alara returned from checking on the twins and sat on the opposite end of the couch. Not too close, not distant either, just present. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Florida homes have their own quiet soundtrack at night. The hum of a refrigerator, palm leaves brushing softly against the windows, the low rhythm of air moving through the vents. Finally, Kingston broke the silence. "You said earlier that you already knew." Alara nodded once. "You also said people leave slowly." Another nod. Kingston leaned forward slightly. "So, what did you do while you were waiting?" The question hung in the air. Alara studied her hands for a moment before answering. "I paid attention." "To what?" "To the spaces between things." Kingston frowned. "That sounds mysterious." "It's not mysterious," she said gently. "It's just honest." He waited. Alara leaned back into the couch. "Do you remember when Julian and Juliet were born?" Kingston's expression softened immediately. Of course, he remembered everything about that day. The hospital room, Alara gripping his hand tightly during contractions, 2 tiny cries filling the air minutes apart. He had cried too, not quietly either. Real tears, the kind that surprise men who didn't grow up around emotional chaos. "You were scared," Alara said with a small smile. I wasn't scared. You were terrified. Kingston smiled reluctantly. Okay, maybe a little. Alara laughed softly. You kept asking the nurse if twins were harder. I was being practical. No, she said with a grin. You were realizing life had just doubled. They shared a small laugh. The memory carried warmth. Then Alara's expression grew thoughtful again. Something changed for me that day. What do you mean? She paused before answering. You remember how everyone came to visit? Yeah, your parents stayed 3 days. They wanted to help. They did, Alara said. Kingston's parents had always been polite to her. Friendly, but careful. Like people handling fragile glass. Alara had grown familiar with that type of politeness in certain white spaces. Not hostility, just distance wrapped inside good manners. Kingston watched her closely. You never told me any of this before. No. Why not? Because it wasn't important yet. The word yet lingered between them. Kingston felt a small knot form in his chest. What made it important now? Alara stood up and walked toward the bookshelf near the wall. She pulled down a framed photograph, then returned to the couch and handed it to him. Kingston studied the picture. It showed a neighborhood block party from years earlier. Music, food tables, neighbors laughing. Alara stood in the center wearing a bright yellow dress. Kingston had his arm around her shoulders. Julian and Juliet were toddlers sitting inside a stroller. What about this picture? He asked. Alara smiled softly. That day meant something to me. Why? Because it was the first time you stayed the whole party. Kingston looked confused. What do you mean? Alara laughed gently. You used to leave early. I did not. Yes, you did. When? Every time the music got loud. Kingston thought back. Cookouts, family gatherings, front yard barbecues filled with Alara's cousins, neighbors, and friends. He remembered feeling slightly out of place sometimes. Not unwelcome. Just different. You always said you had work emails, Alara continued. Kingston rubbed the back of his neck. Sometimes I did. Alara raised one eyebrow playfully. Sometimes. He sighed. Okay, maybe I wasn't used to everything. That's fair, she said. Alara's family gatherings can feel like a festival. Exactly. They both laughed again. But the laughter faded quickly. Because Alara wasn't telling this story for nostalgia. She was building toward something. You see, she said thoughtfully, I grew up in spaces where people looked like me. Church, hair salons, cookouts, front porches with loud debates about basketball and politics. Kingston nodded slowly. And I grew up in quiet suburbs where the loudest thing on Saturday morning was lawnmowers. Exactly. She leaned back again. For a long time we thought blending those worlds was enough. Kingston felt the knot in his chest tighten. What are you saying? Alara didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked him a question. Kingston, when was the last time you asked me if I felt lonely? He opened his mouth, then stopped, because he couldn't remember. Alara wasn't accusing him. Her voice stayed calm. Just curious. That's not fair, Kingston said quietly. I worked hard for this family. I know you did. I built everything we have. I know that too. Kingston sounded frustrated. Then what are you trying to say? Alara took a deep breath. Sometimes people build beautiful houses. She gestured gently around the living room. But forget to check if everyone inside feels at home. The sentence landed quietly, but it shifted something inside Kingston. For the first time that night, he felt something deeper than guilt. Perspective. 10 years. How many moments had he missed? Not because he didn't care, but because he had been trained to notice different things. Alara watched his face carefully. Then she added something he didn't expect. But here's the part you never noticed. Kingston looked up. What part? Alara smiled. I stopped waiting for you to notice. His eyebrows furrowed. What does that mean? It means I started building parts of my life that didn't depend on you understanding everything. Kingston leaned forward. Like what? Alara stood and walked toward the hallway. She returned holding a small notebook. This, she said. Kingston looked at the notebook. What is it? Alara handed it to him. He opened the first page. Inside were notes, ideas, reflections, plans, dozens of them. Some pages messy, others carefully organized. Community ideas, Thoughts about parenting. Questions about identity. Thoughts about marriage. What am I looking at? Kingston asked. Alara sat down again. You're looking at the last 3 years of my thoughts. Kingston flipped through the pages slowly. Then he stopped. One sentence had caught his attention. He read it again. His chest tightened. The words on the page said, "If Kingston ever leaves, I want to be emotionally prepared." Kingston looked up immediately. You wrote this 3 years ago? Alara nodded calmly. You expected this? No. Then why write it? She shrugged gently. Because loving wisely means preparing your heart for every possibility. Kingston sat there stunned. 3 years. While he believed their life was simply moving forward, Alara had been quietly thinking. Growing. Preparing. Not for revenge. Not for anger. Just for reality. You've been living in a different world this whole time, he said quietly. Alara shook her head. No. She reached over and tapped the notebook. I've been living in the same world. I've just been paying attention. Kingston stared down at the notebook again, then back at her. Something uncomfortable began settling inside his chest. For 10 years he thought he understood Alara, but the woman sitting across from him tonight was deeper than the version of her he had grown comfortable with. And suddenly leaving didn't feel as simple as it had earlier in the kitchen, because something unexpected had happened during this conversation. The woman he thought he had outgrown was revealing a strength he had never fully seen. Alara stood and stretched slightly. I should get some sleep, she said. Before walking away, she paused beside the couch. Kingston, he looked up. Yes. Her voice softened. You should go see her. You said that already. I know. Why say it again? Alara smiled gently. Because sometimes people need to chase the truth all the way to the end before they recognize it. Then she walked down the hallway and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Kingston alone again, holding the small notebook in his hands, and realizing something that made sleep impossible that night. The woman he thought he was leaving behind had already grown into someone he hadn't finished discovering. Morning in Florida rarely arrives quietly. The sun pushes through the blinds like it has somewhere important to be. By the time the first light stretched across the kitchen floor, Alara was already awake. Some habits become part of a person's rhythm after years of parenting. Coffee brewed, lunchboxes opened, tiny socks paired together like puzzles. Julian and Juliet's backpack sat by the front door waiting patiently for the school bus. The house smelled like toast and warm peanut butter. Alara moved through the kitchen calmly, tying Juliet's small braids while Julian attempted to climb onto the counter like a mountain explorer. Julian, she said without looking up. Feet stay on the floor. Julian paused mid-climb. How did you see me? Alara smiled slightly. Because you always make that same noise with the chair. Juliet giggled. Mommy has superpowers. Julian considered that. Is it mind reading? No, Alara said gently. It's called paying attention. The words floated through the kitchen like a quiet echo from the night before. Kingston stood in the hallway watching them. For a moment, he felt like a visitor in his own house. Nothing about the morning suggested the conversation from last night had happened. No tension, no sharp silence. Just breakfast, just routine. Julian dropped his toast on the floor. Juliet announced she wanted orange juice, but only if it was the sweet kind. Life moved forward, normal. Kingston stepped into the kitchen slowly. Alara. She glanced up. Yes, I'm heading out later today. Her hands continued braiding Juliet's hair. Okay, that was it. Just one word. No questions. No hesitation. Kingston leaned against the counter. Julian looked up from his cereal bowl. Where are you going, Daddy? Kingston hesitated. Before he could answer, Alara spoke gently. Daddy has something important to take care of. Julian nodded seriously. Like work? Something like that, Kingston said. Juliet turned around in the chair. Are you coming back for dinner? The question landed softly. Kingston felt it settle somewhere behind his ribs. I don't know yet, he said. Juliet thought about that answer for a moment. Then she shrugged. Okay. Children accept uncertainty more easily than adults. After breakfast, the twins ran outside to wait for the school bus. The Florida air still held traces of the rain from the night before. The street smelled fresh. Wet pavement, palm trees shining under early sunlight. Alara sat on the porch steps while Juliet leaned against her shoulder. Julian chased a butterfly along the sidewalk like it owed him money. Kingston stood in the doorway watching them. A quiet family morning. Exactly the kind of moment people forget to appreciate until it's gone. Juliet looked up at Alara suddenly. "Mommy." "Yes, baby? Why were you and Daddy talking so long last night?" Alara brushed a curl away from Juliet's forehead. Sometimes grown-ups need to figure things out. Juliet accepted that explanation for a few seconds. Then she said something that only a 5-year-old could say with such confidence. "Well, you're both nice people." She shrugged. "So you'll figure it out." Alara smiled. Children believe kindness solves everything. The school bus arrived with its usual squeaking brakes. Julian and Juliet climbed aboard, waving through the window with dramatic enthusiasm. "Bye, Mommy." "Bye, Daddy." Then the bus pulled away. The street grew quiet again. Kingston stepped onto the porch. "I'm leaving around noon," he said. Alara nodded. "Drive safe." Those 2 words hit him harder than anything she said the night before. Drive safe. No accusation, no pleading, just care. Kingston studied her face carefully. "You're really okay with this?" Alara leaned against the porch railing. "Kingston, you're not going on a dangerous mission." He laughed softly. "It feels a little like one. Then maybe you should pack snacks." Her tone carried light humor, but Kingston sensed something deeper underneath. Confidence. Not indifference. Confidence. "You're not curious about what happens?" he asked. Alara tilted her head. "Oh, I'm curious. Then why aren't you asking questions?" She shrugged gently. "Because curiosity doesn't mean control." Kingston exhaled slowly. "I don't understand how you stay this calm." Alara looked toward the empty street. "I've had practice." With that, she stood and walked back inside, leaving Kingston alone on the porch, listening to the quiet neighborhood, and realizing something that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Alara wasn't trying to stop him, not even a little, and that raised a question he hadn't expected. If she believed he might leave, why wasn't she afraid? By the time Kingston pulled onto the highway, the Florida sun had climbed high enough to flatten every shadow along the road. The morning traffic thinned quickly once he left the city behind. Palm trees lined the highway like quiet spectators while long stretches of open road carried him farther south. He kept the radio off. Silence made thinking easier. At least that's what he told himself. The truth was something else. Music would have distracted him from the thoughts circling inside his head. And right now, those thoughts refused to sit still. Kingston rested one hand on the steering wheel, while the other tapped lightly against the center console. The road ahead stretched in a straight line through miles of bright Florida landscape. Normally he enjoyed drives like this. Open highway. No meetings. No emails. Just space to breathe. But today breathing felt different, because for the first time in months, Kingston felt unsure about the reason for this trip. 6 months earlier, the idea had felt simple. His ex had reached out online. At first it was casual, a message asking how life had turned out, then a few shared memories. College stories, old road trips, late-night laughter that felt easy to remember. The past had seemed warm, comfortable, like stepping into an old pair of shoes that still fit. At least that's what Kingston believed. But now, with the highway stretching endlessly in front of him, something about that belief felt less certain. He thought about Alara, not the Alara sitting calmly at the kitchen table last night. The younger Alara, the one he met 10 years earlier. The memory arrived clearly. A small coffee shop that used to sit on a corner near downtown Jacksonville. Kingston had been wearing a white button-down shirt that morning. Alara had been arguing with the barista about oat milk. Almond milk and oat milk are not the same thing, she had insisted. The barista had shrugged. Kingston remembered smiling behind her in line. Then the accident. Alara turning around too quickly, her elbow knocking his coffee straight out of the barista's hand. The cup tipped. Hot coffee splashed across his shirt. The entire shop froze. Alara's eyes widened. Oh my God. Kingston had looked down at his ruined shirt. Then something strange happened. He laughed. Not politely, not awkwardly. A real laugh. The kind that surprises even the person laughing. Alara stared at him. "You're laughing?" "Well," Kingston had said between breaths, "it's already ruined." She had studied his face carefully. Most people would be mad. Most people take themselves too seriously. That was the moment everything started. Kingston smiled slightly at the memory. Back then, life had felt wide open. No mortgage, no school schedules, no responsibility heavier than deciding what to eat for dinner. But the longer he drove, the more something uncomfortable crept into his thoughts. He wasn't remembering just the excitement. He was remembering the way Alara looked at him back then, not impressed, not cautious, just curious, like she was studying a person instead of a reputation. Kingston changed lanes as a truck passed him slowly. The highway remained mostly empty. Miles of road, miles of thinking. He remembered their first apartment, small. The air conditioner rattled every time it turned on. The kitchen sink leaked if you left the faucet running too long. But Alara had turned that tiny space into something warm. Music playing while she cooked. Laughing when the electricity flickered during summer storms. Sitting on the balcony at night talking about the future. Kingston tightened his grip on the steering wheel slightly. He had almost forgotten how simple those days were. Not easy, just honest. Another memory surfaced. The day Alara told him she was pregnant with twins. Kingston had stared at the ultrasound picture like someone handed him instructions written in another language. Two, he had asked. Alara laughed. Yes, Kingston. Two. He remembered pacing the apartment that night while Alara sat on the couch watching him. You're going to be a great father, she had said. I don't even know how to hold a baby, he admitted. You'll learn. Her voice had been calm, confident, exactly the same way it sounded last night when she told him to go see his ex. Kingston exhaled slowly. That was the part he couldn't stop thinking about. Alara hadn't tried to stop him. Not once. No argument. No emotional explosion. Just quiet acceptance. And for some reason, that made the drive feel heavier. The highway curved slightly as he passed a stretch of wetlands. Sunlight reflected off the water in bright flashes that forced him to squint. Kingston leaned back in the seat. For months he had convinced himself he was chasing unfinished love. But now a different question kept pushing its way into his thoughts. What if he wasn't chasing love at all? What if he was chasing familiarity, the life he had before responsibilities multiplied? Before school buses, before late-night worry about bills, before the quiet weight of being someone's father. Kingston rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. The realization unsettled him, because if that was true, then this trip wasn't about rediscovering love. It was about escaping pressure, and that was a very different motivation. He glanced at the navigation screen. 30 more minutes. Not far now. Kingston adjusted his grip on the steering wheel again. The road ahead remained straight, but his thoughts felt less certain than they had when he left the house that morning. Alara's voice echoed again in his mind. Familiarity isn't the same as love. He had nodded when she said it, but he hadn't fully understood what she meant. Now he wasn't so sure, because somewhere between Jacksonville and the quiet coastal town he was driving toward, Kingston had started asking himself a question he wasn't prepared to answer. What if the thing he believed was missing from his life had actually been there all along? By the time Kingston reached the coastal neighborhood, the afternoon sun had softened into a warm golden light that stretched across the quiet streets. The houses here looked familiar. Neatly trimmed lawns, white fences, driveways wide enough for 2 cars, the kind of neighborhood Kingston recognized immediately. Orderly, predictable, comfortable. It reminded him of where he grew up. He slowed the car as the navigation voice announced the final turn. Palm trees lined both sides of the street, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze coming off the water somewhere nearby. Kingston pulled up in front of a small white house. He turned off the engine. For a moment he didn't move. The quiet inside the car wrapped around him like a pause before something important. This was the moment he had imagined for months. The moment he believed would answer the questions he'd been carrying. But now that he was here, the certainty he felt earlier had thinned. He glanced at the house again. Then he stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he walked toward the front door. Before he could knock, the door opened. His ex stood there. She smiled warmly. It's been a long time. Kingston nodded. Yeah, it has. For a brief second they just looked at each other. 10 years changes people, in quiet ways. Not always obvious, but noticeable. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. The hug was polite, comfortable. But Kingston noticed something immediately. It felt lighter than he expected. Not empty, Just lighter. They stepped inside. The house was tidy. Soft music played somewhere in the background. Sunlight filtered through wide windows across the living room. "Do you want coffee?" she asked. "Sure." She disappeared into the kitchen while Kingston looked around. Family photos weren't on the walls here, just framed artwork and a few decorative shelves. It felt peaceful, but also quiet. She returned a moment later with 2 cups and handed one to him. They sat across from each other on the couch. For a while the conversation moved easily. Old memories, college stories, road trips from their early 20s, mutual friends who had moved away or gotten married. The past has a way of making conversations feel comfortable, because everything inside it has already happened. Nothing unexpected waits there. Kingston laughed at one story about a camping trip where they had gotten completely lost for hours. "You insisted the map was upside down," she said. "It probably was." "No, Kingston, it wasn't." They both laughed. For a moment the familiarity felt exactly the way he remembered. Easy, natural, comfortable. But as the conversation stretched longer, Kingston noticed something small. Every story they told lived in the past. College, old apartments, places they used to go. The conversation never moved forward. Eventually the stories slowed. Silence settled briefly between them. She studied his face carefully. "So," she said gently, "tell me about your life." Kingston leaned back slightly. "Well, you know the basics. Marriage, kids." She nodded. "Twins, right?" "Yeah." "How old are they now?" "5. A small smile crossed her face. "That must be a lot." "It is." He took a sip of coffee. "They're great, though. What are their names?" Kingston didn't hesitate. "Julian and Juliet." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's nice." Another pause followed. Kingston noticed something unexpected happening in his chest. When he talked about the twins, the room somehow felt smaller. Not uncomfortable, just distant, like the most important parts of his life existed somewhere far away from this house. His ex leaned forward slightly. "I'm glad you came." Kingston nodded. "Me too." She studied him for a moment longer. Then she asked the question that had been hovering quietly all afternoon. "So, are you leaving her?" The words settled into the room slowly. Kingston didn't answer immediately. Earlier that morning the answer would have been simple, but now his thoughts felt more complicated. "I don't know," he admitted. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You don't know?" "I thought I did. But now." Kingston looked down at his coffee cup. "I'm not as sure as I was yesterday." She leaned back thoughtfully. "That's interesting." "Why?" "Because when we started talking again, you sounded certain." "I know." "So what changed?" Kingston hesitated. The truth felt strange to explain. "I think I started remembering things differently." "Like what?" He looked toward the window. "Life." She waited quietly. Finally she spoke again. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you miss who you were before everything got complicated." Kingston frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She shrugged lightly. "You and I were young. No kids. No serious obligations. Life felt lighter." Kingston leaned back slowly. Her words weren't wrong, but something about them didn't sit comfortably either, because the memories he had been replaying during the drive weren't about freedom. They were about Alara, the way she laughed when storms knocked out the power in their first apartment, the way she held his hand when the twins were born, the way she stood calmly in the kitchen the night before. Kingston exhaled quietly. "I don't think that's the whole story," he said. His ex watched him carefully. "Maybe not," she admitted. Then she asked something else. "Do you regret marrying her?" The answer came out before Kingston could overthink it. "No." Both of them paused. Kingston felt the words settle heavily inside his chest. He hadn't planned to answer that quickly, but the truth didn't wait for careful thinking. His ex nodded slowly. "That tells you something." Kingston stared down at his coffee again, because suddenly he realized something important. For months he believed he was searching for unfinished love. But sitting here now, inside a house full of old memories, those memories felt like photographs, nice to look at, but flat, still, and far away from the life he had built. His ex set her cup on the table. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes people don't actually miss the person. Kingston looked up. What do they miss? She smiled slightly. The version of life that existed before responsibility. The sentence hung in the air. Kingston sat there quietly for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Because deep down, he was starting to wonder if she might be right. Not about Alara, about him. And that realization changed the way he looked at the room, at the past, at the reason he had come here in the first place. For the first time since he left home that morning, Kingston began to wonder if the thing he believed he had lost was never missing at all. The living room grew quiet after Kingston answered. No, the words still hung between them. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. His ex studied his face carefully, as if trying to understand the speed of that answer. Kingston leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He hadn't expected the word to come out so quickly, but it had. And now he couldn't take it back. The truth sometimes moves faster than thought. His ex broke the silence first. Well, she said slowly, that tells you something. Kingston nodded slightly, but he wasn't ready to explain what that something was, because he was still figuring it out himself. He looked around the living room again. The same soft music played in the background. Sunlight rested across the floor near the window. Everything in the house felt calm, but inside his chest, something was shifting. For months he believed this moment would feel like closure, or excitement, or relief. Instead it felt like something else. Distance, not uncomfortable, just distant, like visiting a place you once lived. You remember where everything used to be, but the feeling of belonging is gone. His ex leaned back into the couch. You're thinking a lot, she said. I guess I am. What about? Kingston took a moment before answering. I thought coming here would make things clearer, and it did. She smiled slightly. That sounds promising. Kingston shook his head. Not the way I expected. She waited patiently. Finally, he said what had been forming in his mind since the drive. I think I confused memory with connection. His ex tilted her head. What do you mean? Kingston searched for the right words. When we started talking again, everything felt familiar. That's normal, she said. People reconnect all the time. I know. He paused. But familiarity isn't the same as closeness. The sentence surprised him slightly as he said it, because it sounded exactly like something Alara might say. His ex studied him thoughtfully. You're talking about your marriage? Yes. Or us? Kingston exhaled slowly. Both. Another quiet moment passed between them. Kingston looked down at his hands. For months he had convinced himself that returning here would feel like rediscovering something unfinished. But now, the feeling was different. Not wrong. Just incomplete. His ex reached for her coffee cup. You know what's interesting about memory? She said. What? It usually highlights the best parts. Kingston nodded. That's true. It leaves out the difficult parts. He thought about that. Then another memory surfaced. Alara standing in their first apartment kitchen, music playing from a small speaker while she cooked. She had flour on her hands from trying to make homemade bread. Kingston remembered teasing her about the mess. You're turning the kitchen into a disaster zone. She laughed. Great food requires risk. The bread had turned out terrible. They ate it anyway, and laughed the entire time. Kingston smiled faintly at the memory. His ex noticed. What are you thinking about? Just something from a long time ago. With me? Kingston hesitated. No, he didn't add the rest. The memory belonged to Alara. His ex nodded slowly. That probably says something too. Kingston leaned back into the couch. The room suddenly felt smaller. Not physically, emotionally. For the first time that afternoon, he realized something uncomfortable. Every memory he was replaying inside his head involved Alara. Not the early excitement, not the thrill of youth, but the small, ordinary moments that built a life. Morning routines, late-night talks, watching their children fall asleep. Things that didn't seem dramatic at the time, but now felt important. Kingston rubbed his forehead. I think I misunderstood something. His ex raised an eyebrow. What? I thought love was supposed to feel exciting all the time. She laughed softly. That's a lot of pressure for love. I know. He looked toward the window again. The truth is, my life with Alara stopped feeling exciting. And that scared you. Yes, but now I'm starting to realize something. What? Kingston spoke slowly. Excitement isn't the same as depth. His ex nodded thoughtfully. That's true. Kingston looked down again, because another realization had arrived quietly behind the first one. He hadn't fallen out of love. He had mistaken stability for absence, routine for boredom, peace for something missing. And now that misunderstanding felt heavier than he expected, because suddenly he saw his marriage from a different angle. 10 years, 2 children, a home filled with laughter, and a woman strong enough to let him leave without begging. Kingston leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since reconnecting with the past, he understood something clearly. He hadn't come here to rediscover love. He had come here chasing a version of himself that no longer existed. And that realization changed the way he looked at everything. Not just the past, but his marriage, and the quiet strength of the woman waiting at home. The quiet in the living room stretched longer than either of them expected. Kingston leaned back into the couch, staring at the ceiling for a moment before lowering his gaze again. The coffee on the table had cooled. Neither of them had touched it in several minutes. His ex watched him carefully. "You're somewhere else right now," she said. Kingston gave a small nod. "Yeah, back home." The word home landed differently now, not as a place, as a realization. "Something like that," he answered. She rested her arms along the back of the couch and tilted her head slightly. "You know," she said, "when we started talking again, you sounded very sure about things." "I know. You sounded like a man who had already made a decision." Kingston sighed quietly. "I thought I had. And now?" He rubbed his hands together slowly, buying himself a few seconds before answering. "Now I think I was chasing the wrong question." She raised an eyebrow. "What question?" Kingston looked toward the window. Outside, a breeze moved through the palm trees lining the street. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "I kept asking whether I was still happy. That seems like a reasonable question. Maybe." He paused. "But I never asked why I stopped feeling happy." His ex considered that. "And have you figured it out?" Kingston leaned forward slightly. "I think I confused calm with emptiness." She didn't respond immediately, so he continued. "My life slowed down. Work became routine. Parenting became a schedule. Every day started looking the same. And you thought that meant something was missing?" "Yes." His ex nodded slowly. "That happens to a lot of people." Kingston studied the floor for a moment. Then he spoke again. "But the strange part is, when I started thinking about what actually matters in my life," he stopped, because the answer had already formed clearly in his mind. His ex waited patiently. "What?" she asked. Kingston met her eyes. None of it was here. The sentence wasn't cruel, just honest. She absorbed the words quietly. Then she smiled faintly. "That must be confusing." "It is." Kingston leaned back again, because the truth inside him had begun forming into something larger, and it felt uncomfortable to admit. For months he had convinced himself the past held unfinished feelings, but now the past felt smaller, not meaningless, just finished. His ex tapped her fingers lightly against the couch. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She looked at him carefully. "Do you regret marrying her?" The question arrived without warning. Kingston didn't hesitate. "No." The answer came out instantly. Not thoughtful, not cautious, immediate. Both of them noticed it. The room went still again. Kingston blinked once, almost surprised by the sound of his own voice. He hadn't planned that response. He hadn't weighed the options. The word had simply appeared. His ex watched him closely. "Well," she said quietly, "that was fast." Kingston let out a slow breath. "Yeah, it was." Most people would pause before answering something like that. "I guess so. But you didn't." Kingston rubbed his forehead, because now that the answer had been spoken, he couldn't ignore what it meant. For months he had questioned his marriage, questioned his happiness, questioned whether he had chosen the wrong life. But when the moment arrived, there had been no hesitation, no regret, just certainty. His ex leaned forward slightly. "That tells you something important." "I know." Kingston stared down at his hands again. The truth was beginning to settle deeper inside his chest. Not regret for his marriage, regret for misunderstanding it, for mistaking quiet stability as something missing, for believing excitement mattered more than consistency. He thought about the kitchen the night before, Elara standing calmly beside the stove, not begging him to stay, not accusing him of betrayal, just listening. Kingston shook his head slightly. I think I spent months convincing myself I wanted something different. And now I'm realizing I never actually stopped valuing what I had. His ex smiled softly. That happens more often than people admit. Kingston looked around the living room again. The same sunlight, the same quiet furniture, the same peaceful environment that once represented possibility. But now something about the room felt finished, like a chapter that had already been read. His ex picked up her coffee again, though it had long gone cold. You know what I think? She said. What? I think you came here expecting to feel something dramatic. Maybe, but instead you're realizing something quieter. Kingston nodded slowly. That's exactly it. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was reflective. Kingston stood up and walked toward the window. From there he could see the street outside. A neighbor walking a dog, a car passing slowly, ordinary life continuing. He thought about Julian chasing butterflies that morning, Juliet asking if he would be home for dinner, the smell of toast in the kitchen, and Elara leaning calmly against the porch railing. Kingston spoke without turning around. I don't regret marrying her. His ex nodded behind him. I believe you, and that realization scares me a little. Why? Kingston finally turned back toward her. Because it means I might have been looking for the wrong answers all along. She smiled gently. That's not a failure. It feels like one, only if you refuse to learn from it. Kingston considered that. Then he walked back toward the couch. For the first time since arriving, his thoughts felt clearer. Not finished, but clearer, because the answer he gave without hesitation had revealed something deeper than months of reflection. He hadn't been chasing love. He had been questioning himself. And now that question was beginning to resolve into something uncomfortable but honest. He hadn't chosen the wrong life. He had simply stopped appreciating it. Kingston stayed a few minutes longer after the conversation ended, not because there was more to say, because leaving felt like the final confirmation of something he had only just begun to understand. His ex walked him to the front door. The late afternoon light had softened outside, casting long, warm reflections across the quiet street. They stood there for a moment, neither of them pretending the afternoon had changed their past. It hadn't, but it had clarified the present. Well, she said gently, I'm glad you came. Kingston nodded. Me too. She crossed her arms lightly. So what happens now? Kingston took a breath. I think I need to go home. The word home carried a different weight now. She noticed. A small smile appeared on her face. That sounds like the right direction. Kingston chuckled quietly. I think so too. They shared one last polite hug. Not emotional, not complicated, just two people acknowledging that a chapter had already closed. Kingston stepped outside. The air felt cooler now. A breeze moved softly through the palm trees lining the street. For the first time that day, the tight feeling in his chest had begun to loosen. He walked to the car slowly. The door shut with a solid click. The engine started. For a moment he sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel. Then he pulled away from the curb. The neighborhood disappeared behind him as he returned to the highway. Traffic was light. The road stretched long and open again. But the drive back felt very different from the drive earlier that day. Earlier, he had been chasing a question. Now he was carrying an answer. Not a simple one, but a real one. Kingston kept the radio off again. This time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt thoughtful. He replayed the afternoon conversation piece by piece. The laughter, the memories, the realization that the past felt smaller than he expected. It wasn't disappointing, just distant, like a photograph tucked inside a drawer. Nice to look at, but not where life happens anymore. A notification sound broke his thoughts. His phone vibrated on the passenger seat. Kingston glanced at the screen when traffic slowed slightly. A message. From Elara. 3 words. Drive safe home. That was all. No questions. No pressure. No hidden meaning. Just care. Kingston stared at the message for several seconds. The simplicity of it hit him harder than anything else that day. She hadn't asked how the visit went. She hadn't asked if he was coming back. She hadn't demanded reassurance. Just those 3 words. Drive safe home. Kingston rested his head briefly against the seat, because suddenly the entire day looked different through that small message. For months he believed love had to feel intense to be real. Exciting. Dramatic. But maybe real love sometimes looked quieter. Maybe it looked like someone who trusted you enough to let you figure things out. Someone who didn't try to control your choices. Someone who cared about your safety even when the future felt uncertain. Kingston exhaled slowly. Alara had done something most people struggle to do. She gave him space. Not because she didn't care, because she cared enough not to trap him. That realization carried weight. He thought back to the kitchen the night before. The moment he told her he never loved her the way he should have. The calm way she accepted the sentence. At the time, he thought it meant she was emotionally distant. Now he wondered if it meant something else. Strength. Confidence. The kind of love that doesn't beg. Kingston adjusted his hands on the steering wheel. The highway signs for Jacksonville appeared ahead in the distance. Home was getting closer. He thought about Julian running after butterflies that morning. Juliet asking if he would come home for dinner. And Alara standing quietly on the porch. For the first time that day, a new feeling began forming inside his chest. Not relief. Fear. Not the fear of leaving. The fear of realizing how close he had come to losing something important. Kingston spoke quietly to himself. I almost walked away from this. The sentence hung inside the car. He imagined what the house might look like without him. Julian asking questions. Juliet watching quietly. Alara rebuilding her life without waiting. Because Kingston knew something now that he hadn't fully understood before. If he had left, Alara would have survived. She had already prepared herself emotionally. That notebook proved it. She wasn't weak. She wasn't dependent. She was simply someone who loved deeply but refused to hold someone hostage. And suddenly Kingston understood something that unsettled him. The strongest love he had ever experienced was the one he almost underestimated. The road curved slightly as the sun began sinking lower toward the horizon. Golden light spread across the highway. Kingston slowed slightly as traffic increased near the city. His phone screen still showed Alara's message. 3 simple words. Drive safe home. Kingston picked up the phone at a red light. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then he typed a short reply. On my way. The light turned green. The car moved forward again. And as Kingston drove the final miles toward the house he shared with Alara, Julian, and Juliet, he carried a realization that had taken months to reach him. Peace isn't the absence of love. Sometimes peace is exactly what love looks like after it has grown strong enough to last. And now, for the first time since he left that morning, Kingston felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement, not nostalgia, something steadier, clarity, and a quiet hope that he hadn't realized the truth too late. The sun had already dropped below the rooftops when Kingston pulled into the driveway. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the evening light. Porch lights glowed softly along the street, and somewhere down the block a dog barked lazily at passing cars. Kingston turned off the engine, but stayed in the car for a moment. The house looked exactly the same. Front porch light on, curtains slightly open. The quiet kind of home that doesn't try to impress anyone. Just a place where people live. But returning felt different from leaving. Leaving had felt decisive. Returning required humility. Kingston stepped out of the car. The gravel under his shoes sounded louder than usual as he walked toward the front door. When he opened it, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Cinnamon, warm and sweet. The scent drifted through the house like a welcome that didn't need words. Kingston stepped inside. Soft jazz played from the kitchen. The lights were warm, and Alara stood at the counter, rolling dough with calm focus. For a moment, Kingston didn't speak. He simply watched. Flour dusted her hands. Her sleeves were pushed halfway up her arms. The movement of the rolling pin was steady and unhurried. Alara glanced up. "You're back." Her voice carried the same quiet tone as always. Kingston nodded. "Yeah." He set his keys on the counter. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The jazz music continued softly in the background. Then, Alara brushed flour from her hands and placed another tray on the counter. "How was the trip?" she asked. Kingston leaned against the counter across from her. "It was interesting." She smiled faintly, That usually means complicated. That's accurate. Alara continued shaping the dough into small rolls. Kingston watched her carefully. The normalcy of the moment made his chest feel tight. Finally, he said it. I think I made a mistake. Alara didn't stop working. What kind of mistake? The kind where you chase something old and realize it doesn't belong to you anymore. She nodded thoughtfully. That happens. Kingston studied her face. You're not going to ask what happened? No. Why not? Alara placed the rolls carefully into a baking pan. Because the details belong to you. The answer carried quiet respect, and somehow that made Kingston feel even more uncomfortable. He ran his hand through his hair. Alara, I think I've been wrong about a lot of things. She slid the tray into the oven and closed the door. Such as thinking I understood our life. Alara leaned against the counter now, facing him fully. That's a big realization. Kingston laughed softly. Yeah, it is. He hesitated before continuing. I thought I was missing something. And I realized something strange. Alara waited patiently. The peace I have with you. I thought it meant something was missing. She raised an eyebrow slightly. And now I think it meant something was working. A quiet smile appeared on her face. Not triumphant, just warm. Kingston took a breath. I'm not going back to her. The sentence sat between them. Clear. Final. Alara nodded once. Okay. Kingston blinked. That's all you're going to say? What else should I say? I don't know. Something dramatic. Alara laughed softly. Kingston, this isn't a movie. He smiled reluctantly. No, it's not. The oven hummed quietly behind her. The smell of cinnamon grew stronger. Kingston leaned against the counter again. Alara, there's something I still don't understand. What? You said you already knew. I did. And you said you were preparing yourself. Yes. Kingston hesitated. So why were you so calm? Alara considered the question carefully. Then she walked to the table and sat down. Her voice softened slightly. Because I had already decided something. Kingston pulled out the chair across from her. Decided what? That my happiness couldn't depend on whether you stayed. The words landed gently, but they carried enormous weight. Kingston leaned back slowly. That sounds harsh. It's not harsh. It's honest. Alara folded her hands on the table. For a long time I loved you the way people are taught to love. What do you mean? Like my whole future depended on you. Kingston looked down. And that changed? Alara nodded calmly. Not because I stopped loving you. She met his eyes. But because I started loving myself too. The kitchen stayed quiet after Alara spoke. But because I started loving myself too. Kingston didn't answer right away. The sentence wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Yet it carried a kind of clarity that made it difficult to respond quickly. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the kitchen. Same wooden table. Same magnets holding Julian and Juliet's drawings on the refrigerator. A small paper dinosaur Julian had made in school hung crooked beside a drawing of Juliet's rabbit. Life had continued in this house even while his thoughts had been drifting somewhere else. Kingston rubbed his hands together slowly. I think that's the part I didn't see, he admitted. Alara tilted her head slightly. What part? That you were changing? She smiled softly. Everyone changes. I know that now. The oven clicked quietly as the heat adjusted. The smell of cinnamon spread through the kitchen, filling the space between their words. Kingston studied Alara's face. You said something earlier that stuck with me, he said. What was that? You said loving wisely means preparing your heart for every possibility. Alara nodded. Yes. Kingston leaned forward. That sounds like you expected me to leave. No, she said calmly. I expected life to be unpredictable. He frowned slightly. What's the difference? Alara rested her arms on the table. The difference is fear. Kingston waited. If I had expected you to leave, she continued, I would have lived in constant worry. But preparing my heart meant something different. What? It meant understanding that my peace couldn't disappear just because someone else changed their mind. The words were simple, but Kingston felt them settle heavily inside his chest. You weren't protecting yourself from me, he said slowly. No. You were protecting yourself from losing yourself. Alara smiled. That's a good way to say it. Kingston leaned back again. For years he believed he was the stable one in the marriage, the one who worked long hours, the one who planned for the future, the one who made sure the bills were paid and the house stayed secure. But now he was seeing something he hadn't fully noticed before. Elara had been building something too, just not the kind that showed up in bank statements. She had been building emotional strength. Kingston exhaled slowly. I underestimated you. Elara raised one eyebrow playfully. Just a little. He laughed quietly. More than a little. Another moment passed. Then Kingston asked something he had been thinking about since the night before. When did this change happen? What change? When you started seeing things differently. Elara looked toward the window for a moment. Night had settled outside. Streetlights glowed softly along the road. Then she spoke. Do you remember when the twins started kindergarten? Kingston nodded. That first week was chaos. Julian had cried the first morning. Juliet had walked into the classroom like she owned the building. Elara chuckled at the memory. Yes, it was. She folded her hands again. After they started school, something unexpected happened. What? I had quiet time during the day for the first time in years. Kingston listened carefully. At first I didn't know what to do with it, she continued. For years my entire schedule revolved around the twins. But suddenly I had space to think. And that's when the questions started. What kind of questions? Elara smiled slightly. The kind people usually avoid. Kingston leaned forward again. Like what? Like whether I was living the life I wanted, or just the life that happened. The honesty in her voice caught his attention. And what did you decide? Elara looked directly at him. I decided that happiness had to come from more than one person. Kingston sat quietly. Meaning me, meaning anyone. She continued gently. If my entire emotional world depended on you staying, that would make both of us prisoners. Kingston nodded slowly. That makes sense. It also makes love fragile. How? Because the moment someone feels trapped, they start looking for the exit. Kingston absorbed that. Then he asked another question. So, you stopped depending on me? Elara shook her head. No, I stopped depending on you for my identity. The distinction mattered. Kingston leaned back again. For years he had believed love meant building a life so closely together that everything became shared. But Elara had discovered something deeper. A relationship works best when two people are whole on their own, not when one person becomes the other person's entire world. You grew a lot, Kingston said quietly. Elara smiled. So did you. He looked surprised. Did the first? Yes. How? You came home. The words landed gently. Kingston lowered his gaze. That doesn't feel like growth. It is. Why? Because pride would have kept you away. Kingston considered that. Then he shook his head. Elara, I almost destroyed this marriage. She didn't argue. Instead, she spoke calmly. You almost made a decision. Same thing. Not quite. Kingston looked up. Why not? Because people who destroy things don't usually come back and admit they were wrong. Kingston didn't know how to respond to that. For a moment, the kitchen returned to quiet. The oven timer beeped softly. Elara stood and walked over to remove the tray. Warm cinnamon rolls filled the room with a comforting smell. She placed the tray on the counter. Kingston watched her carefully. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since the drive home. Elara, were you really ready for me to leave? She paused before answering. Then she gave him the most honest response she could. Yes. Kingston felt something tighten in his chest. You were prepared to lose me? I was prepared to keep living. She turned and met his eyes again. With or without you. The truth in that sentence didn't feel cold. It felt strong. And Kingston realized something in that moment that made the situation even clearer. The woman he had married 10 years earlier had become someone even stronger than he realized. Someone who could love deeply without losing herself. And suddenly Kingston understood something important. If their marriage survived this moment, it wouldn't be because Elara needed him. It would be because she chose him. The cinnamon rolls cooled slowly on the counter. Warm steam rose in thin spirals while the kitchen filled with a comforting smell of sugar and spice. It was the kind of scent that usually meant a peaceful evening in their house. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. Not tense, just honest. Kingston remained seated at the table while Elara placed the tray down and reached for 2 plates. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that appears when two people are finally saying things they had avoided for years. Alara slid one of the plates toward him. Try one before they get cold. Kingston picked up the roll slowly. He broke off a piece and tasted it. Soft, warm, familiar. Still the best baker in Florida, he said. Alara laughed quietly. I'm sure Florida has better options. Not in this kitchen. They shared a small smile. But Kingston knew something important still needed to be said. He placed the plate down. Alara, yes? I don't expect things to just go back to normal. Her eyes softened slightly. That's good. Kingston nodded. Because I know they can't. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. I hurt you. Alara didn't rush to deny it. Instead, she answered honestly. Yes, you did. The directness of the response sat quietly between them. Kingston didn't look away. I meant what I said earlier, he continued. I made a mistake. You told me you were leaving. I know. And you told me you never loved me the way you should have. Kingston winced slightly. Hearing the sentence out loud again made it heavier. Yes. And now you're saying you want to stay? I am. Alara folded her hands calmly. Do you understand why that's complicated? Kingston nodded immediately. Of course. Then explain it. The request surprised him, but he thought carefully before answering. Because words matter, he said. And when someone hears those kinds of words, they don't disappear overnight. Alara studied his face. That's part of it. What's the other part? Trust. Kingston nodded again. That too. She leaned back slightly in her chair. When people break trust, they often want to repair it quickly. Kingston listened. They apologize. They promise change. They try to prove everything will be different. And sometimes they get frustrated when healing takes longer than expected. Kingston recognized the truth in that description. I understand, he said quietly. Alara tilted her head. Do you? Yes. Then you understand why things can't just go back to the way they were yesterday. I do. Another quiet moment passed. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall. Kingston finally spoke again. Alara, I'm willing to earn it. She didn't react immediately. So he continued. Trust, respect, whatever it takes. His voice remained calm. Not desperate, just honest. I know I don't get to walk back into this house and pretend nothing happened. Alara watched him carefully. Then she asked something simple. Why? Kingston frowned slightly. Why what? Why are you willing to earn it? The question forced him to think. Not about guilt, about truth. Because today made something clear, he said slowly. What? That I misunderstood what I had. Alara listened. I thought peace meant something was missing. And now I think peace was the reason everything worked. The answer felt complete. But Alara didn't rush to accept it. Instead, she said something that surprised him. You know something interesting about rebuilding trust? What? It takes longer than breaking it. Kingston nodded. That makes sense. Sometimes much longer. I'm prepared for that. She looked at him thoughtfully. Are you? Yes. Even if it takes months? Yes. Even if it takes years? Kingston didn't hesitate. Yes. The conviction in his voice was clear. But Alara remained thoughtful. Not skeptical. Just careful. Because she understood something Kingston was still learning. Love could survive mistakes. But rebuilding it required patience. Finally, she spoke. Kingston, I'm not saying no. Relief flickered briefly across his face. But I'm not saying yes either. The relief faded into understanding. That's fair, he said. Alara nodded. I care about you. I know. You're the father of our children. I know. And 10 years together isn't something people erase easily. Kingston listened carefully. But rebuilding a marriage requires more than regret. What does it require? Consistency, time, and actions that match the words. Kingston leaned back slightly. I can do that. Maybe. The honesty of that answer didn't discourage him. If anything, it felt real. The future wasn't guaranteed, but it wasn't closed either. Alara stood and carried the tray of cinnamon rolls to the center of the table. Then she sat down again. You know what my grandmother used to say? She asked. Kingston smiled slightly. I'm guessing I'm about to find out. She used to say that love isn't proven during the easy seasons. When is it proven? After disappointment. Kingston absorbed the sentence slowly. That makes sense. She nodded. If two people can still choose kindness after hurting each other. She paused. Then the love might actually be real. Kingston looked at her carefully. I want the chance to prove that. Alara didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a small bite of the cinnamon roll and looked toward the hallway where Julian and Juliet were sleeping. The house felt quiet again, but this time the quiet carried possibility, not certainty, possibility. And before we move toward the final chapter of this story, let me pause for a moment. If this story has touched you so far, take a second to subscribe to Mr. Stevens Stories. These stories are here to remind us that life lessons often appear in the most unexpected moments. And if this story reminds you of someone who might need to hear it, share it with them. Because sometimes a simple story can help someone see their own life more clearly. Now the real question begins. Because the hardest part of love isn't falling into it. It's deciding what to do after it has been tested. And Kingston was about to learn that rebuilding something meaningful requires more than good intentions. It requires time and the courage to prove that some lessons truly change a person. The house had grown quiet again. The cinnamon rolls were mostly gone, leaving only a few crumbs on the plate between them. The jazz music had ended a while ago, and the kitchen lights cast a warm glow across the table. Alara gathered the plates and carried them to the sink. Kingston stayed seated for a moment, watching the small movements of an ordinary evening unfold. Water ran softly as she rinsed the dishes. The same kitchen where their entire conversation had begun the night before now felt different, not resolved, just clearer. Kingston leaned back slightly in his chair. 10 years. The number sat heavily in his mind. 10 years of shared mornings. 10 years of small routines. 10 years of learning how another person thinks, laughs, and worries. When people talk about marriage, they often describe the big moments, weddings, births, anniversaries. But Kingston was realizing something else. The real weight of 10 years lived inside the small things. Julian falling asleep in the car after a long day at the park. Juliet insisting that bedtime stories required different voices for every character. Alara laughing when he burned pancakes one Sunday morning. Those moments weren't dramatic, but they were the architecture of their life. Kingston stood slowly and walked toward the sink. Need help? Alara glanced over her shoulder. You can dry. He grabbed a towel from the counter. For a few minutes they worked quietly together. Simple movements. Passing plates back and forth, the kind of rhythm people develop after years of living together. Finally, Kingston spoke. You know what surprised me today? What? How small the past felt. Alara dried her hands and leaned against the counter. Small? Yes. For months I thought seeing her again would answer something important. And it didn't. He set the towel down. It just made me realize how much of my life is here. Alara listened without interrupting. Kingston looked around the kitchen, the refrigerator drawings, Julian's plastic dinosaur sitting near the window, Juliet's rabbit toy resting on the couch. You build a life, piece by piece, he said quietly. And sometimes you don't realize how much it matters until you imagine it gone. Alara crossed her arms thoughtfully. That's true. Kingston hesitated before continuing. I've been thinking about something all evening. What? How easily I could have walked away from this. The sentence carried weight, not dramatic, just honest. Alara didn't rush to respond. Instead, she asked a simple question. What stopped you? Kingston considered that carefully. Perspective. What kind? The kind that only shows up when you leave your own routine for a while. He walked toward the table again. When I was driving earlier today, I kept replaying old memories. With her, at first, and then the memories started changing. Alara waited patiently. They stopped being about the past, Kingston said. They became about you. Alara raised one eyebrow slightly. That's interesting. Kingston smiled faintly. Not the exciting memories either. What kind? The quiet ones. He looked down at the table, like the way you stayed awake the night Julian had a fever, or how you made Juliet laugh when she was scared on her first day of school. Alara listened quietly. Kingston continued. For a long time I thought love had to feel exciting to be real. And now Now I think love might actually look like consistency. The word hung between them. Consistency. The kind of love that doesn't demand attention, but quietly holds everything together. Ilara studied his face carefully. You've done a lot of thinking today, more than I expected. Kingston leaned back again. Then he said something that mattered more than anything else he had said all evening. Ilara, I want to choose this marriage. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she asked a thoughtful question. Choose it how? Not because it's comfortable, not because we've already invested 10 years, but because it's worth building. Ilara considered his words carefully. Kingston continued, I know that choice doesn't erase what I said yesterday. I know trust takes time, but I want to make that choice anyway. He met her eyes. Every day, if I have to. The kitchen grew quiet again. Outside, the night air moved softly through the trees along the street. Ilara finally spoke. You know something interesting about choosing love? What? It's not a one-time decision. Kingston nodded. I'm starting to understand that it's a daily practice. I'm ready for that. Ilara studied him for a long moment, not judging, just listening, and Kingston realized something important in that silence. For the first time since their conversation began the night before, he wasn't trying to convince her. He was simply telling the truth. The kitchen grew still again after Kingston finished speaking. I wanted to choose this marriage. The sentence lingered between them like something fragile that needed time to settle. Ilara didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a glass on the counter and filled it with water. The sound of the faucet running softly filled the pause. Kingston remained where he was, leaning against the table, watching her, not waiting for approval, just waiting for honesty. Ilara took a sip and placed the glass down. Then she looked back at him. You know something about choices? She asked. What? They're easy to say. Kingston nodded slowly. I figured you might say that. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms lightly. Choosing love in a calm kitchen is easy. Kingston listened carefully. Choosing love when things feel uncertain, she continued. That's the part people struggle with. I understand. Do you? Yes. Ilara studied his face for a moment. What does choosing this marriage actually look like to you? Kingston didn't rush the answer. He took a moment to think. It means showing up, he said finally. How? Not just when things are comfortable. He walked a few steps closer to the counter. It means paying attention to the things I ignored. Ilara tilted her head slightly. Like what? The spaces between things. A small smile appeared on her face. You were listening. I was. Kingston continued. I spent years believing that providing stability was enough. That's not nothing, she said. I know, but I miss things. Like what? The emotional side of our life. Ilara didn't argue. She simply waited. I thought if the house was paid for and the kids were safe, everything else would take care of itself. That's how a lot of people think. I know. Kingston looked toward the hallway where Julian and Juliet were sleeping. But relationships need attention the same way children do. Ilara nodded slowly. They do, and I stopped paying attention. The admission came without defensiveness. Just clarity. Ilara watched him for a long moment. Then she asked another question. Do you know why I told you to go see her? Kingston thought about that. I assumed it was because you wanted the truth. That's part of it. What's the other part? Ilara walked back toward the table and sat down again. I needed to know something. What? Whether your confusion would survive reality. Kingston frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means memories can be powerful. She folded her hands calmly on the table. But memories aren't the same as real life. Kingston nodded slowly. And I knew that if you didn't go see her, a part of you would always wonder. That's true. So I let you go find out. Kingston sat down across from her. You trusted the outcome. No. What then? I trusted myself. The distinction mattered. Kingston leaned back slightly. That's a different kind of confidence. Ilara smiled gently. It took years to build. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Ilara continued. You said you want to choose this marriage. I do. But love isn't measured by intentions. How is it measured? By patterns. Kingston listened carefully. Anyone can say the right words in one emotional moment. That's fair. But the real question is, what happens next week? Next month? Next year? Kingston nodded slowly. You're saying consistency matters? Yes, more than promises. Kingston thought about that. Then he said something simple. I'm willing to prove it. Alara raised an eyebrow slightly. How? By being present. In what way? Kingston leaned forward slightly, listening more, paying attention, not assuming I understand what you're feeling. Alara considered his answer. Then she asked something unexpected. And if things get uncomfortable again? Kingston didn't hesitate. Then, the first stay, even if it's difficult? Yes, even if it forces you to look at parts of yourself you don't like. He nodded. Yes, the confidence in his voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Alara watched him quietly. Then she said something softer. You know, healing doesn't happen in big dramatic moments. Kingston nodded. I believe that it happens in small decisions. Every day. Yes. Alara looked toward the hallway again. Julian and Juliet were still asleep. The house felt peaceful. But peace had a different meaning now. Finally, she spoke again. You said earlier you misunderstood something about our marriage. I did. What was it? I thought excitement meant love was working. And now I think stability might actually be the stronger form of love. Alara smiled slightly. That's a lesson many people learn too late. Kingston leaned back in his chair. I almost did. The honesty in that sentence didn't sound dramatic. It sounded real. They sat quietly again for a few seconds. Then Alara asked one final question. Are you prepared for something? What? The possibility that rebuilding takes time. Kingston nodded. I am. Even if the progress is slow. Yes. Even if I'm not ready to trust everything right away. Yes. Alara looked at him carefully, not suspicious, just thoughtful. Then she gave the answer that would shape everything moving forward. We'll see. The words were simple, but they carried meaning. They weren't rejection. They weren't acceptance. They were possibility. Kingston didn't argue. He nodded slowly. That's fair. Alara stood and began clearing the table. Kingston helped without being asked. The small action felt natural. Two people working side by side in a quiet kitchen, not pretending everything was fixed, but not walking away either. Before we move to the final part of this story, let me pause for a moment. If this story has made you think about your own relationships, take a second to subscribe to Mr. Stephen Stories. Stories like this remind us that love isn't about perfection. It's about growth. And if you know someone who might need to hear this message tonight, share this story with them. Because sometimes a single story can help someone see their life a little more clearly. And now the story reaches its final moment. Because the real meaning of love is not found in dramatic declarations. It's found in the quiet choices people make when the house is still and the truth has already been spoken. The kitchen slowly returned to quiet after the dishes were finished. Alara wiped the counter while Kingston dried the last glass and placed it carefully in the cabinet. The simple routine felt familiar, almost comforting, even after everything that had been said that night. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the Florida night had settled into its calm rhythm. A faint breeze brushed against the trees along the street, and distant crickets filled the silence between moments. Kingston leaned against the counter and looked down the hallway. Are the kids asleep? He asked quietly. Alara nodded. They were already out before you came back. Julian usually fell asleep quickly after long school days. Juliet preferred bedtime stories, but once she drifted off, she rarely woke up until morning. Kingston hesitated for a moment. Then he said something that felt simple but important. Can we check on them? Alara looked at him for a second, then nodded. Of course. They walked down the hallway together. The house felt different at night. Quieter, almost reflective. Kingston pushed the bedroom door open slowly. Julian and Juliet were exactly where they had been left earlier. Julian slept stretched across the mattress in his usual way, one arm hanging off the side of the bed like he had conquered something in his dreams. Juliet slept curled neatly beside him, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. The soft glow from the hallway light reached just enough into the room to show their peaceful faces. Kingston stepped inside carefully. For a moment he just stood there, watching them breathe. There are moments in life when everything becomes clear without anyone saying a word. This was one of those moments. 5 years earlier, these two small people had arrived in the world. Since then, every day of Kingston's life had been shaped around them. School mornings, doctor visits, birthday parties, Tiny questions about dinosaurs and princesses and why the sky changes color in the evening. Those ordinary moments had built something deeper than excitement. They had built responsibility and love. Kingston spoke softly. I almost changed their whole world. Alara stood beside him in the doorway. Yes, she said gently. Kingston didn't look away from the bed. But I didn't. No, Alara replied. You didn't. Julian shifted slightly in his sleep and pulled the blanket closer. Juliet murmured something quietly and rolled onto her side. The room stayed peaceful. Kingston finally stepped back into the hallway. He closed the bedroom door halfway, leaving it the way Alara always did at night. When they returned to the living room, the house felt even quieter than before. Kingston sat on the couch. Alara sat in the chair across from him. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt reflective. Kingston finally broke it. You know what I realized today? Alara leaned back slightly. What? For months I thought I was searching for something. And I was. What was it? Kingston took a moment before answering. Perspective. Alara listened. I thought love had stopped working, he continued. But the truth is, I had stopped noticing it. Alara nodded slowly. That happens sometimes. Kingston looked around the room. The framed photos on the wall showed pieces of their life together. Family trips, birthday cakes, Julian's first day at preschool, Juliet holding a crayon proudly beside a messy drawing. 10 years of life captured in simple moments. Kingston spoke quietly. People think love is the exciting part at the beginning. That's what movies show. But I think the real part comes later. What do you mean? The part where two people stay, even when life becomes routine, even when things feel uncertain. Alara studied him carefully. That kind of love takes patience. I'm learning that. He leaned forward slightly. For a long time I thought excitement meant something was alive. And now I think peace might be the stronger version of love. Alara smiled gently. That's a lesson some people spend their whole lives learning. Kingston nodded. I almost learned it too late. The honesty in his voice carried weight. But Alara didn't respond with judgment. Instead, she said something thoughtful. You know why I didn't panic when you said you were leaving? Why? Because love that has to trap someone isn't real love. Kingston absorbed that slowly. So you let me go? Yes. And you were prepared for me not to come back? I was. Kingston leaned back into the couch. That kind of strength is rare. Alara smiled softly. It's not strength. What is it? It's clarity. Kingston nodded slowly, because that word described the entire night. Clarity about love, about family, about the life they had built together. He looked toward the hallway again. Julian and Juliet slept peacefully just a few steps away. Kingston spoke quietly. I want to protect this. Alara didn't interrupt. Our family, our home, the life we've built. Alara folded her hands thoughtfully. And how will you do that? Kingston smiled faintly. The same way it was built in the first place. How? One day at a time. Alara nodded slowly. That's the only way it works. The clock on the wall ticked past another minute. Neither of them rushed the moment. Because sometimes the most important decisions in life aren't loud. They happen quietly. In living rooms. In kitchens. In small houses filled with memories. Kingston leaned forward again. Alara, thank you. For what? For letting me learn this lesson. Alara tilted her head slightly. Lessons are only useful if people actually learn from them. I did. She smiled gently. We'll see. Kingston laughed quietly. That seems to be your favorite answer tonight. It's an honest one. They sat together in the quiet room, not pretending everything had been repaired, but understanding something important. Their marriage hadn't been magically fixed. Trust would take time. Healing would take patience. But something meaningful had happened. The truth had been spoken, and the choice to move forward had been made. Outside, the Florida night continued peacefully. Inside the small house, two parents sat quietly together while their children slept down the hallway. A family not perfect, but real. And sometimes real love looks exactly like that. Not loud, not dramatic. Just two people willing to keep choosing each other after life tests them. Because love that allows someone to walk away often becomes the love they return to once they understand where home truly is. Before we close this story, remember something simple. Stories like this remind us that relationships aren't built on perfect moments. They're built on growth, patience, and the courage to face difficult truths. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you enjoy powerful life stories like this one, stay connected with Mr. Stephen Stories for more moments that inspire reflection and growth. Because sometimes a single story can change the way we see our own lives.